We're going to start by talking about how feminism, intersectionality, and power play out in a number of different choices. And then we're going to talk about what a feminist approach to online consultation revealed in our experience in Yemen. So starting with the how, the first thing that we wanted to share a bit was how platform choice was impacted, or how feminism, intersectionality, and power played into our choice of platform, so our choice of using WhatsApp. Chris, do you want to talk to us about that?
Yes, thanks, Elena. So first, just to frame the platform choice, it's a new emerging horizon in the work we do. We're all researchers with a lot of background in doing field research and offline research, and today more than ever, there's a need for digital research with the pandemic, but also with the economic crisis and all the limitations on travel. How can we adapt offline or traditional feminist methodologies to the online field? So in our process, as Elena mentioned, we at some point we used Zoom, which is the platform that we're using now, which allows us to host people, to coordinate a conversation, to ask people to raise hand or to mute or to open mic. And then we tried WhatsApp, and here's what we learned. So we want to share with you 5 key things that we learned that we felt are more closer to the feminist principles of research than anything else. So one, Zoom allows for a formal setting, right? You specify the time, you use it according to a time zone. So you always have to work with the adaptability of time zones. So women come to your time availability rather than us going to their time availability, whereas WhatsApp allows for a more informal setting. It's a conversation. It's more, women are more acquainted, and also users generally are more comfortable chatting on a group conversation rather than going live or going into a conversation where they don't know the other. There's an expectation to turn on their cameras or to turn it off. This also, using Zoom, it allows for a specific time. So we all know we need to subscribe to have more than 40 minutes, but also if we want to extend it and make it 2 hours, it always needs to be specific to a certain amount of time. Whereas with WhatsApp, we can have a conversation ongoing over one question of research for 10 hours, for 20 hours, and Mira will talk more about how we did that when we facilitated the conversations. The third difference between Zoom and WhatsApp is Zoom gives more power to the facilitator, which is a main concept we try to deconstruct as feminists. On Zoom, the facilitator can silence, can put someone on mute, can send instructions, can make sure no one can talk before they raise their hands. So there's a lot of power to the facilitator and how they want the conversation to go. They can say, okay, we're done answering this question, let's move to the other question. Whereas on WhatsApp, women can answer 10 hours later a question that you asked at the beginning. So you have less power as a facilitator. You cannot control or censor or limit participant interventions or opinions or experiences. Also with Zoom, because we need to be specific and tight on time and move from one question to the other, this hinders a bit the capacity for the participants to tell us the link, for them to take us through their narrative and their biographical story and tell us through their experiences, where they feel things intersect, how one question can lead to the other question. Sometimes they can answer all your questions in just one voice note without you having to ask them, because they've already made the link, because they have more space to express. And lastly, and these are just 5 things we wanted to share today, but we're always happy to discuss it more. It's the allowing all participants, particularly women who are today the subject of our conversation, to express the way they want. We always read articles about women having less self-confidence or not taking up too much space. And Zoom is, to be honest, favors people who are comfortable starting on the mic, showing up on the camera and taking space. Whereas the less people who are less comfortable doing that, they don't have space to share. And by the time she wants to share, maybe we move to another question. Whereas on WhatsApp, she can share GIFs, she can share memes, she can send a voice note, she can write a text, she can talk to you in private. So that's why today in our work at Build Up, we have found that WhatsApp is the most feminist tool today if it's used in a feminist way. Obviously, it helps us meet feminist principles, but it's also the closest to communities possible, more than Zoom at least. So yeah, thanks, Elena. Was I on time? Was it safe?
You were so on time, Chris. You were so on time. I didn't even give you a 1 minute warning. No, but I also want to say that Chris just did this like extremely fast overview of this platform comparison that we did in between Zoom and WhatsApp, which I was also thinking, Chris, we didn't talk about this, but that, you know, we could extend that to other platforms as well. We've just done it between those two because that's how it came up. I'll put a link to a blog post that Chris and I co-wrote on these things, where Chris developed this table in a bit more detail that she essentially just talked us through. So you can see it in writing as well. It's in English and Arabic. So we'll share it in a minute so you have that. But while I do that, I just wanted to pass it over to Mida to talk a bit about, again, how did feminism, intersectionality, and power play out when we were thinking about both the outreach to invite participants into these consultations, and also the actual kind of operations of the consultation. So the timings, you know, what it took to bring people on, etc. Because I just want to say and acknowledge that Mina at one point told me that she was actually just living on WhatsApp because she had so many windows open and was talking to so many people. So she's going to tell us a bit about that.
Yes, action point for me that still has not been kind of crystallized since the consultations is to kind of situate those on a different number. It was very much part of my existence for those few days, and Christelle as well. But yeah, I mean, I think what Christelle said about, I don't know about a tool being the most feminist tool, but the way that we were able to use it definitely in comparison with other things that are available to us. In these times when everybody talks about the cutting edge and when everyone talks about which methods that we use to be more inclusive, I think it's really important to talk about something like WhatsApp with this much and uplift WhatsApp to a place that it deserves to be. It can definitely give us the agility that we need. And before we, well, I mean, I guess after we determined that WhatsApp would be the right platform for this kind of exercise, we were also working in parallel to actually outreach to participants who would be with us in these consultations. And there was a specific approach to that we really were trying to be intentional about how horizontal it would be, and to be inclusive in our approach, not in terms of we need diversity, we need to check a box, we need to be inclusive just for the sake of being inclusive. Also shying away from, you know, the idea that there is a core of people who are always talked to and then a periphery of people who are not talked to at all. I think WhatsApp helped us also complexify this as we were going into the outreach exercise. So before the consultation started, we were in agreement with our partners that we wanted to diversify the people who would be in attendance. We wanted to diversify the methods that we would outreach to them through. And we would also, you know, try to create different channels to reach geographic areas, professional networks, and just profiles of women who are not usually reached out to when there are such formal conversations happening. And what Zoom does, for example, in that instance would be to just decidedly exclude people who can't get online at that determined time. And watching a recording of something that's already happened is not the same as actively participating in it. So we started on two different tracks. We first also did a kind of very surface level social media scan to understand also when we talk about low-hanging fruit, when we talk about usual suspects, these are also people who are present in the online sphere in Yemen already. We did a small analysis to find out who from there could be part of our community mobilizer network. And we also used our own connections through other avenues in which we've worked in Yemen to kind of probe different governorates that aren't usually reached out to either. In between those, we were also very careful because we were asking for people's personal phone numbers directly, because that's the only way you could be added to a WhatsApp group. And you know, that's not always easy in terms of the process of building trust. So I'll talk about this a little bit more in the operations. But in terms of the outreach, this was the process. It was a very targeted and slow side conversation personally to each of the 100+ women who we reached out to in the first phase, to gauge interest, to explain more about what the intention behind this research was, to explain what we will do with this information, where it will be stored if that question comes up, how it will be documented, what aspects of people's security and safety may or may not be compromised as a result, And of course, the way that this outreach will materialize into the groups and the conversations. That link isn't always, easy to make, going into something that may seem a bit abstract, a WhatsApp consultation on peace and conflict. So after this outreach, we had 90 plus also women who were willing to be engaged, and we grouped them randomly. And this is where, the operations of how the conversations happened were really materializing. The agility that WhatsApp gave us was primarily in timing, I think, before everything else, because that's the lowest, it didn't have much risk on the flow of conversation and the participant safety and security. And it really the cost benefit of that was huge in terms of how flexible when we were in welcoming inputs. So the focus groups were 10 focus groups that ran in parallel, and they've spanned in length from 24 hours to 72 hours in length. And we were talking 72 hours of on and off conversations, welcoming inputs in whatever medium and whatever timing was suitable for the women participants. It became very much something that accompanied them as they went about their day, especially because the headlines that we were discussing were very close and were really touching each participant's realities. Yeah. And I think that speaks to the work that happened before, and how this wasn't being talked about as something theoretical. And I know we'll cover also some of the headlines that we actually spoke about in a bit. So the idea that this really personal and what we see as an almost very invasive platform in its essence was able to be tweaked so that, all of a sudden you're in this other space that is not more formal. It's just being used in a completely counterintuitive way, allowed us to, I think, us as researchers appreciate that platform, but also allowed for the women participants to differentiate between this and other exercises, other similar exercises that have been done. Not just from people like our partners at OSESCI, but in general, these exercises tend to be very exhausting for women and happen in places that are unfamiliar. This was happening with people who were unfamiliar for most of these participants, but in a space that was very familiar for them in terms of how it operated.
This is the copyright sentence. Can we quote this sentence and tweet it? Okay.
Did you want to say anything else on that, Chris? I know you're saying you agree, but
that you highlighted at some point during the consultations, Mira, from her knowledge and the context in Yemen specifically, she's been there, she's visited, and we know that people in Yemen are generally more active at night than during the day. So, for example, Mira would tell me, don't get offended if no one answered yet. You'll see at 11 p.m. they'll answer. And at the end of the consultations, we were having a small conversation, and we said, how did we think that we could do Zoom meetings at 12 p.m. when no one even starts their day or their social life or their ability to have conversations before night? So this also was one of the ways that made the women feel more comfortable.
Yeah, it was definitely a lesson.
Yeah, and I think that also touches on something, right, Chris, the way you just said it, because one of the things that I think really distinguished this consultation is that we were genuinely trying to have a conversation, and timing is critical to that, because if you have a Zoom or even a WhatsApp thing that is only during work hours, the kind of inputs you're going to get are very different, right? We got very conversational inputs that, given the importance of really understanding the lived experience of women in Yemen, was pivotal, right, to the kind of inputs that we were getting. And even when you were describing the way that people were really being very conversational about, well, what about this and what about that, like that back and forth was happening because it was this kind of semi-informal space, as you were describing, Mira. So yeah, that's super interesting.
Before we go into another heading, I also think it's important to touch on this idea of building trust in a place. In a virtual space, and this touches on so many things that are specific to the Yemen context, but then so many others that have to do with how you approach something like this intersectionally. And I think when we talk about Yemen, there's also there are very specific connotations that get assigned to conversations that happen around political headlines in general. And then more specifically and more compromising to many women's safety and security is this heading of peace building. it's been tackled and brought to the forefront in so many ways that are not that are not intuitive to what we know to be peace building or peace even in general. So when we were introducing the conversations, we had to emphasize that we're not asking people to come in and talk about how they want to build peace, and then that's it. Or what do you think about peace? Thanks, got our survey, got our checklist, we're done. It was more about, we want to field these perspectives because they matter and because no one has asked them from these areas before, for example. And also that the fact that you can finish your work, not worry about who you're saying these words in front of, go back to your safe space where you feel actually comfortable, voice noting us for 6 minutes straight about how you feel about these couple of questions, made all the difference. Because yes, we are doing this as our work. We're not doing this just because we want to have a chat, but the setting around it and the preliminary conversations that built that trust made huge strides, because it actually created that familiarity and closeness between participants to just go on discussing things that are relevant to their realities, and then really feed our curiosities in a way that we didn't feel was extractive, and we eventually also felt that our participants shared that. So yeah, I'll stop there, sorry.
No, I think it's great that you did that extra loop, because I think this issue of trust building online is one that a lot of people in the sort of peace building mediation world are kind of struggling with, right? Especially since the pandemic. And I just want to say, I have a huge debt to the experience that you had there in the conversations we were having about how that trust was happening, because in parallel to this piece of work, we had been asked by the UN Mediation Support Unit to develop a training course for mediators about digital mediation and facilitation online, which is available on our website. Julie will ping it to everybody in a second. And one of the sections there is about trust building, because it is such a nebulous space, this space of building trust online and what it means, especially because we know that narrative and identity formation operates so differently online, right? On WhatsApp, on social media, on Zoom. So I just think it's a really interesting, how do you do that? And it's about navigating this actually as more of an informal space and creating trust from that. So yeah, love those reflections. And I am going to move us on to another heading. So the last heading on this kind of like, how did feminism, intersectionality and power play out, is really about it connects to this final point about trust building, because it's about the tone and the style of the facilitation, of the question design and documentation. So Chris, I think you were going to tell us about that.
Yes, but first a small disclaimer, you will still have to transcribe 8 minutes of voice notes. This is not the funnest part of the work. But it's definitely more substantive. Building on what Mira was saying, and to close with the tone and style, we often tend, as researchers, we often tend to break or to stop a conversation that's going between two people in a research circle. So in a focus group, you really want to get to the point quickly and ask people, if you have additional comments, come back later, or that's not the point, let's stick to the question. Whereas what was allowed on WhatsApp for us to do is women were comfortably talking together. And by talking together, we had so many additional perspectives because of the geographical differences, because of the social class, because of the economic class. So we could see, as researchers, we were really able to get an intersectional analysis done for us. It's really, the women were leading the conversation. And this, in the way we facilitate it, it's challenging, because there's a tendency always to jump in and say, but you're going off track, or maybe, no, let's not say this, it's disrespectful to others or something. But when you let communities who already have been communities for thousands of years, 100, let's not exaggerate, they know how to talk, they know how the difference of opinions happens, and they always come up with, they find their conclusion, which they hand to you on a silver platter, which I feel gives more power to the participants than the facilitators. So in the tone and style, there was a focus between me and Mira. And the way we did it also, we divided the groups. So she was lead facilitator on groups, I was lead facilitator on others, but we were supporting each other on those groups. And it was the flow, because also Mira, when she sent the invitation, also sent a heads up. She said, we will be asking one question every 4 hours. You can respond to it 3 days later, no worries. It's just because we're sticking to the flow of questions that we're gonna do. Because of that, women expected this. And some, it was very interesting. Some were like, when's the next question? Like, when's question 2 coming up? And it was cool to see the engagement, because we weren't here to tell us everything you are and everything you want in 1 hour. We were more like, talk, here are the subjects we're interested in, based on a very comprehensive literature review, based on a country and context knowledge that we had that was very, very important in our team. And in the documentation, which is the last point I wanted to say, usually when we document focus groups, we do these big tables of participant 1, 2, 3, and then on the left we have the questions and we enter each question. Whereas in a similar conversation, it's a lot more challenging to document this way, because you might have 17 answers to one question and then 20 to another question, and it gets very confusing. And it's very hard to document on the spot, because some women follow up their answer with more voice notes or on the side conversation and stuff. So I think what we did with Mira was, one, we took space from the conversation. We didn't document on the spot. At the end of every focus group, we took some time. We discussed the findings ourselves internally. We also decided on the areas that interest us. So personally, I was interested in, I don't know, financial burden, and Mira was more interested in household responsibilities. And we discussed them, and it's like the findings were ingrained in us, and they became our agenda when we were writing, when we were documenting the findings. And therefore, for the first time as a personal experience in research, and because I'm usually very squared in the way I do things and the tools I use, for the first time I had to adapt to an agile platform that does not allow for immediate typing and look, I just delivered my report, but rather take some time, sit on the findings, talk to more women, talk internally. And this way of documentation might not be very comfortable for all researchers, but it's definitely more impactful and insightful for report writing and for impact, impact-driven action.
Yeah, and it's also more real, right, Chris? In the sense that, like, you're not being able to type it up, because as you did have another tweetable moment there where you said, communities, people who have been communities for thousands of years know how to talk, and that also means like this is not, the documentation should come very much after. They're not talking to be documented. They're talking because they know how to talk, and I think that's totally critical. Okay, so that was the how, right? So we talked about, how feminism, intersectionality, and power showed up in platform choice, in outreach, in the operations, and the tone and style. And then it also had an impact on the consultation itself, right? On the consultation results. And so I think what we want to talk about for the next 15 minutes is, what did a feminist approach to an online consultation reveal? And what did it reveal in terms of what we learned and how that was different? In terms of how we learned it and how that was different, and also in terms of how the conversations themselves, we think, have had an impact, and that's important to recognize. Now, in that blog post that we linked to earlier, there is a very short summary of some of the headlines that came out of the actual consultation. But in case you haven't had a chance to look at that, I just want to mention them so that you have a sense of what Mira and Chris are talking about when they're talking about the results of this, right? Because I don't think it was a typical consultation in many ways. So one of I'm going to just talk through some of the headlines. So women talked about how they feel that there's a deterioration of the social fabric in Yemen. And a lot of that had to do with political polarization being mirrored inside homes. And we got a lot of very interesting insights about that. There was also a strong conversation about barriers to mobility as a key feature of women's lived experience, and a lot of talk about the perceptions of women as being the biggest barrier to mobility. There was a conversation also around how the war has impacted women's livelihoods. There is a greater need for paid work, but also a greater need for unpaid care, and how those things balance out in the lives of women. There was a very strong conversation around hate speech and how hate speech about women is widespread. Women referred to a lifetime of hateful narratives and sort of the impact that has starting from a very early age. And then finally, a lot of the women talked about how there is a very limited awareness of the peace process among women. And they spoke openly about the contradiction between how the peace process is depicted in the media and how it is in reality. And there was also this kind of very disheartened about the prospect of any real or meaningful participation for women, despite the fact that they still request that regularly, and they still think that requesting inclusion is very important. Those are very superficial highlights for what was a very intense conversation. But maybe, Mida, you want to start us off on how some of the topics that were discussed and the connection between topics to each other and to daily lives were quite different from other consultations that we have seen.
Yes, for sure. I think, yeah, I mean, intersectionality is definitely the theme today. It's also because when we go into such exercises, we prioritize being very defined in our objectives, which is totally legit and should always be the case. But what it ends up doing also is we compartmentalize a lot of issues, you know, and then the post kind of exercise conversation internally for us as actors ends up being, it's so hard to talk about each one on their own. They're also interconnected, you know, and it dilutes the substance of what can come out of each of these headlines on their own, while not giving enough credit to the fact that they're all interlinked. And so I think in this consultation really set it apart for us, because we talked about additional financial burden on women. We talked about restrictions to women's mobility in Yemen. We talked about the deterioration of the social fabric. We talked about commentary on the national and political peace process. We knew that we needed to divide focus groups among these headlines. We knew that we would be talking about more than one headline in each of them, but we did not control the linkages that were being made between each of these headings, and how much they became a launch pad for actual cohesion among these groups. So like, it wasn't just that we learned that deterioration of the social fabric and additional financial burden are super connected, or that people feel a huge relevance to talk about the national peace process when they talk about their mobility and the area where they live. It was also that because, again, the experience of the consultation was flowing in parallel with women's daily lived experiences, they were able to, internally within the group, make the linkages among each other and create like a springboard for a very valuable conversation between a woman who lives in Sana'a and a woman in, you know, the rural area of Dala. That allowed for us on the back end of that to, yes, differentiate between certain headings, certain keywords that were being used, but really able then to remove ourselves and see it all as a bird's eye view of, look at how this woman's daily journey is kind of touched on by all of these headings. Look at how this other participant has come in and commented on that because she's surprised, for example, that this is that woman's lived reality. Yeah. And how in between the way that they talk about, for example, the hateful narratives that are directed towards them are not, there's not something intentional because we've prompted it as a headline. It's something that's really part of their lived experience. So it was a lesson learned in what it means to be inclusive, because you want people who are closer to certain headlines to come and talk about them, versus giving women the agency to talk very openly about what they experience. And if you've done your research, if you've done your preliminary looking around, and if you don't have an ego as a researcher to say, oh, I was probably wrong about this, I need to revisit, it makes, you know, it makes the full experience very different. And you talk about diversity and inclusion in terms of, I was able to do that as a researcher, rather than, oh, our report was able to uncover this, you know, groundbreaking new information about women's perspectives. And this goes back to, again, a lot of what Chris said about the significance of the platform here. But I'll stop there. I mean, I think we can talk for hours, and we've published a couple of things about this just because we know that we won't cover it today.
Yeah, Nina, do you actually want to take, I mean, I don't know, you touched a bit on the effect of inclusion on the diversity of views that were expressed, but did you want to say something else about that? Because I know that was quite important as well. Do you feel you covered enough of that?
I'll give one small anecdote.
Yeah.
Like, we, the professional networks that we were able to kind of secure participants from, which from their feedback we understood that it wasn't common for them to receive such invitations, was actually women who work in the judiciary field and the legal field. Very much associated with government presence in so many areas, very shielded in terms of political opinion in some ways as well. And we thought, you know, in any other exercise, we would have said, look at this new box that we've ticked. We were able to get legal representatives and medical representatives and civil society representatives. But the difference between the diversity and inclusion as an indicator and diversity and inclusion as a valuable part of the conversation starts to become that this woman's lived experience is a key part of the exchange about these headlines. When we talk about restrictions to mobility, this woman is not going to come in with an expert opinion. She's going to come in because she truly believes that there are laws in place that protect women in certain areas. And the exchange there becomes, wait, that's not my experience. And I'm finally in a place where it's completely random. I haven't spearheaded this whole effort, and I can have that back and forth about what that means. I mean, it's not something that we're talking about in theory anymore, or that we're asking a core group to comment about how this should change for other women. It actually became, I don't know if you remember which group I'm talking about, but it became a very live and like a lively exchange and almost a conflict at one point, and then it kind of just de-escalated on its own because it's not a conditional inclusion, and it's not diversity because we have a quota to fill. It's really just elevating, like uplifting voices that everybody internally in that WhatsApp group, including the facilitators and the participants, agrees needs to be heard. And I think the most valuable part about that was just seeing how those different perspectives had never had a chance to coincide like that.
Yeah.
Because of how we compartmentalize these headlines so often and don't allow for that intersectional bird's eye view of how they all relate to each other.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Mira. I think that just made it really clear to me as well. And I think this also dovetails quite nicely into, I think, the last kind of thought that we wanted to share about what a feminist approach to an online consultation revealed, which is really to talk about the impact that the conversations themselves had, especially in terms of something that you were starting to highlight, Mira, about the agency and power handed to women through the facilitation style and through the platform choice, and how that also changed the way that we decided to close, or rather not close, the conversations. So Chris, do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I want to add to what Mira is saying and make the link here, make the small jump. At some point in the conversation specifically on ongoing political process or peace processes, we were, at the beginning, we were a bit, we didn't know what to do with the fact that almost all participants in the focus groups, when we said, what do you have any recommendations for the peace process led by the UN? They said, what's the UN? What's OSESCI? And then we had a small chat with Mira on the side, like, do we share knowledge? Do we share a Wikipedia link? Do we talk? Do we share that? Or this is the finding itself? And I think this is a great example for talking about the impact, because obviously as feminists ourselves, but also women, we were not going to go with write a report and say 90% of the participants did not know what OSESCI is, so you need to work more on your outreach. No, because the impact and what we intended from this conversation is to actually help surface women's needs and priorities on political agendas. And therefore, we spent a lot of time on the side in private chats with women, sharing and talking and doing phone calls and voice notes and explaining. And we learned a lot from them, obviously, about political processes, but other things. And this is one of the things that we felt had impact in this conversation is one, like Mira was saying, the ability to have conversations and different perspectives and how they built on each other. Two, them realizing the differences between each other. It was very interesting for us when one woman said, I can't travel. Another said, oh, where I am in the south, I can travel. And the third woman said, sometimes I can travel, it depends. And we built on this and we probed and we said, can you tell us more? How is it different? And here I just want to highlight how patriarchy excels at dividing women's issues. They make our issues divided by class and sexual orientation and I don't know, personal favorites, or I don't know what. They divide our causes, and we are left at the end with 10 women fighting for better TV appearances, 10 women fighting for body positivity, and so on. Whereas when women talk together and they see their similarities and they see that it intersects in all of their lives, it was so impactful to see how when women from different perspectives and different areas came together and talked, the end of the conversation was, oh wait, we're all suffering from the same thing. And the last thing I want to add about how the conversations were closed but not closed. Honestly, it was Mira's agenda all along. I didn't know. At the end of the last focus group, I thought this is when I exit all groups and say, thank you very much. It was very nice to talk to you. But Mira said, oh no, of course not. We're not leaving the groups. These are spaces for women to mobilize together, to talk together, to inform each other. And honestly, since, and I don't know, it's been like 7 weeks or 8 weeks that we finished the consultations, we still have those groups. Every once in a while, there's still someone who comes up and says, I'm looking for someone to train me on this or that. And we respond and we engage and we link them and we put them in touch with other women. And I think this is a very important role for facilitators and researchers who, honestly, we are paid to do the work we do. And they are not paid to contribute the knowledge for us to get paid to do the work we do. The least we can do is to network, is to keep this, how to say, equal back and forth, and to close without closing.
Ever.
I mean, I think there's a challenge for us. If that's the least that we can do, then what's the most that we can do?
Yes.
And maybe that's a challenge that we're trying to take internally. You know, what does it actually mean for this to not be an extractive consultation, but for it to be the beginning of a conversation that is actually about handing over agency and power? I don't think we're quite there on that, but we're at least doing the least that we can do. I think with that, we're going to stop talking, or rather hand over to you. No more talking. No. I think what we'd like to do now is to invite questions from all of you who have been listening for the past 45 minutes. We are going to ask you to use the Q&A function. Hifa, I can see that you have raised your hand. If you found the raise hand button, right next to it is the Q&A button. And we would much prefer to take a written question rather than a spoken question. It's just a bit challenging for us with webinar participants to take spoken questions, especially where there's limited connectivity for some people. So if I could ask you to do that, I can see you've put your hand down, so I think that message got across. But also just invite anyone else who has a question to just type it into the Q&A now. And if nothing comes up, Mida, I'm gonna throw a question myself at Mida and Chris, but they probably don't want that. They'd rather answer your questions. They answer my questions all the time. It's getting boring. So I'm gonna give it a second to see if anything comes in. Silence. Maybe people are typing.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Haifa.
People are scanning. Are you scanning the participants? Is that's what's happening, Mida? I can see.
I was wondering if the Haifa you were talking about was Haifa who participated in the consultations, and it is. So.
Oh, okay, that's great. Okay. So we hope that your question comes through soon. While we're doing that, can I actually ask you both personally? You know, some of the conversations that happened and some of the topics that came up were really, I mean, they were things that I definitely hadn't heard before in consultations. You know, there's a lot of organizations that conduct consultations about peace processes. You both know that. So if you had to pick one thing that really stayed with you from those consultations, from the findings, from the results, what would be that one thing that you thought, oh, this is really something that needs to be highlighted and that somebody needs to hear about?
Ready? Go.
Yeah.
For me, it was when we wrote the report, at some point we wrote, women are not entitled to political opinion, but they're expected to have one. I think coming from this side of the world, Arab cultures, where we know that it's not really, let's say we're not raised to be included in politics in the future, where our parents talk about politics, the girls stay in the kitchen, or we all know these gender roles that we fit in, and we need to actively seek a political knowledge. What we saw in the Yemen experience is how not even when you decide not to have a political opinion, or when you decide to be completely far from this, society or the political field in Yemen will tell you your political affiliation based on your father's, your husband's, or your brother's political affiliation. And I think this has so many consequences of women's daily lives, their careers, their jobs, their education, who they marry, who they can be friends with, without them even having a say in it. So for me, this was a very important finding, and very harsh to see patriarchy being enacted in so many spaces in our lives. خلاص, yeah. So that's
yeah, I can see that touched you quite personally, Chris. The sort of like the parallel with your lived experience, right? And that kind of, yeah. We did get a question, so Mira, you're off the hook for now. I'll come back with something else. But Maud is asking, a lot of the things you talked about are very human: building relationships, creating a casual tone, one-on-one outreach, etc. This contrasts with the idea, and she didn't write this, but I'm going to say this: the idea that we know a lot of people in the peace building and mediation field have. That we can do digital consultations for thousands of people at once through virtual tools, whatever that is. And so I think the question is, do you think the human element means that these kinds of consultations, so these kinds of kind of very broad-based, very big consultations scaled, ultimately actually have to remain quite small? So any kind of digital consultation has to be more on the scale of what we did. I don't know if we mentioned this, but the consultation that we ran, 115 women were invited and 93 actively participated. So there's two things that are interesting about those numbers. Number one, 115 isn't thousands, it's 115. And the second one is that's a very high response rate for any kind of consultation, even in-person ones. So that's, I think that both of those things are quite interesting. But yeah, Mira and Chris, what do you think about this thing? Do they have to actually remain quite small? Is it possible to scale this kind of human touch?
I don't think we've discussed this, but I can go and then tell me if you disagree.
Yeah,
go.
Do it.
I think it's not about, I don't think it's about the number that you start with. I think it's about the number of people within each virtual space. And, you know, it's not a Zoom breakout room. It's a WhatsApp group. There's a difference there. We were able to, I mean, these 10 WhatsApp groups, if we did this exercise with 1,000 women, I think we would have still been able to, with enough time, with more resources, with more humans, able to take this to a level where it could be expandable, repeatable, to a huge number. Will it be efficient in the same way to be able to like kind of give this level of analysis for something that happened in such a condensed way with that many more participants? I'm not sure. I think this amount of people was really great for us to delve into almost like the one-on-one interactions when needed, drawing parallels on a much smaller scale. So there were benefits, but I definitely think that it's doable and it's expandable because WhatsApp has that capability as a platform. And we're biased to that platform now as well, because we've just come out of that experience. And I don't know anything else that hits personal lives as closely. I would just say that it's really in the details. It's really about how the operations are organized and what you believe is a logical like number for you to carry on those conversations and portion it out, in a way that suits the substance of the exercise.
Can I add to this just very quickly?
Yeah, go for it.
What Mira is on the level of implementation and technically what you have in terms of resources. I also want to add, Maud, it really depends on what you want from the research. If you're doing gendered patterns or gendered priorities, yes, I think you should stick to casual tone, to outreaching to women, to diversity and inclusion. If you're doing a pandemic to see why people aren't vaccinated, it's a whole other research. It's the politics of it are different. So it really depends on what you're trying to do. And we haven't had yet the opportunity to work on such scale digital consultation project. But I think we all look forward to seeing more of this and testing more. It's been a year and a half that we have been forced to move digitally. and we're still learning, and we're hoping through this conversation to add to the body of knowledge on what's happening digitally and how can we make, and especially with the contradiction of social media is the most offensive and the scary place for women. At the same time, how can we make it the safest place for them to talk about what they want? And I think there's something to capitalize on in this moment. So come back to us if you have an experience like this, Maud.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. Yes. Yes. I think it's interesting because I'm reading between the lines of what Maud wrote, also because we all know her, obviously. So it's easier to read between the lines when you know someone. But I think Maud was really thinking about these kind of, there's been a couple of attempts by different UN bodies to do these kind of very large scale consultations actually on social media, right? Where it's kind of thousands of people logging onto either Facebook, or there was a specific platform where people were logging onto. And I think it is really hard to keep that kind of human touch on those. And then if you're also doing the analysis through text analysis, then, Chris, you and I are just trying to work on text analysis for a different project in Lebanon, and we know how much nuance is lost. And a lot of what was coming out in these consultations was very nuanced, right? So I just wonder whether scale is more about, in this case, is more about who and different people who are coming through in this ways. And I know Mida and Chris, you're also trying to, there's a couple of comments in the chat that you're trying to deal with, but in the meantime, another question has come up. So maybe I can direct the question at one of you and the other of you can look at what's in the chat. So Najat was saying, what kind of topics were consulted on through digital consultations? And what was the effect on the issues of concern to women? So that's quite, which one of you wants to take that?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah.
I guess just also being mindful of time, I will quickly say the topics that we covered, the headlines that we covered in this consultation, and maybe kind of what the purpose of talking with women about them was. So there were 5 topics: hateful narratives towards women, خطاب الكراهية تجاه النساء, restrictions on women's mobility, we can say them in Arabic, تحديات على التحرك بالحياة اليومية, additional financial burden on women, العبء المالي الزايد على النساء خاصة مع تداعيات الحرب والصراع والنزاع باليمن, and the ongoing the deterioration of the social fabric, تفكك العلاقات النسيج الاجتماعي داخل المنزل وكمان بالمجتمع بشكل عام, and the ongoing political peace process أو عملية السلام السياسية اللي عم بتصير واللي عم بيبلشها باليمن مكتب المبعوث الأممي. So those were the 5 headings, and we were in partnership with OSESCI going into these. Apart from our interest in those headlines as researchers, we were hoping that the perspectives and impressions that we fielded as part of this exercise would be raised to much more effective places when it comes to the work of a place like the Office of the Special Envoy, to diversify the opinions that they have when it comes to whatever kind of documentation or production they use to incorporate women's perspectives into their larger political work, and also for us to spearhead an idea of starting networks and connections on the ground in Yemen to see Build-Up's vision of a just and peaceful society where people can thrive, moving forward with the connections on the ground that we weren't able to make in any other during any other project or exercise. I wanted to before we take Aishatu's question, I wanted to just comment on Haifa's inputs in the chat.
Which only you can see, Mida, so you need to say what the inputs were.
Yes, so I think Haifa was maybe commenting a little on when we started talking about the different topics, saying that hateful narratives towards women truly increase their risk to danger, things like prison, forced disappearance, and of course she means other injustices. And maybe something that we said might have given the impression that we were talking about one political camp or perspective when we talk about the risk that women face when we talk about political processes or the peace process, And so she was emphasizing that from all political sides, it's very important for there to be pressure from women towards the United Nations and similar organizations to move forward with their work in a way that suits their needs. ان شاء الله اكون اخذت انطباعك مثل ما لازم هيفا، بس قولي لنا اذا في شيء ثاني مش واضح او اذا بدك تزيدي شيء.
Thanks, Mila. So I think it's, yeah, I was just going to say thanks. Did you want to add something on Haifa's comment? Sorry, I missed that.
No, she's going to add
okay.
it.
Yeah, just saying thanks for that. And Najat is also saying thank you for your answer. So then let's close on this last point from Aishatu, and then I just have something very brief to say. So maybe a quick thought on what would be a follow-up of the WhatsApp consultation, and how could such a methodology be scaled up? I mean, we could do a whole webinar on that, but if you want to just give one thought each on that point, and then we'll close on that. It's a great closing question.
I don't know if it's healthy of me to say, Elena, what do you think actually? Genuinely.
That's just smart to throw it back to me. No,
it's genuinely, I don't know.
I mean, I think you know what I think. I think that that I wouldn't even call it a follow-up. I think that the fact that we kept those WhatsApp groups open is critical. And one of the things that came out in the conversations that you were having was women really talking about the lack of a safe space to continue talking. So I think one possible way for us to continue supporting an open space would be to say, what other ways are there for this conversation to continue and to connect to political processes that you think are important? And those can be political processes, you know, like with a big P, like the peace process, but it can also be about community mobilization. So I think that's one aspect, is like, since we opened up and we started holding this space, and then can we basically continue to hold it for a bit longer? But I think, you know, how does this methodology scale up is really not an answer that the three of us should be answering. I mean, sorry, not a question that the three of us should be answering. I think that from our side, what we should eventually do is completely exit and not, you know, and be as hands off as possible. Now, we know that there is a certain value in having somebody who's outside of a very difficult and a very conflicted context holding space, that we do that in a lot of places. And I think there's always this balance about when do we then exit that space. And I think what's incredible about what you two did is how you were very aware of your privilege and your power in the way that you facilitated those spaces, right? But we'll continue to have it. Like, the fact that we're aware of it doesn't mean we don't have it. So I think it's about how do we kind of enable that space to stay open and also slowly back out of it. That's there's a lot more to be said there. What do you two think? Does that resonate?
Yeah, I agree a lot. So speaking of like privilege and power, I think the fact that Yemen as a place that conflict actors and political actors, etc., deem as a conflict-prone zone or a fragile zone or whatever it is, means that it's very saturated in terms of projects. Let's be honest, projects, interventions, international actors on the ground. With that reality, it creates a crazy dissonance for me to exist in a place where we know that the civil society space is so saturated, while at the same time, these WhatsApp groups were a breakthrough for so many women.
Yeah.
By the end of the exercise, it was super counterintuitive to hear that the thank yous that we received for giving the opportunity for women from different areas to just sit in the same virtual space and talk.
Yes.
So I think that it's really important to highlight that where we go from here is to actually debunk everything we know about the methodology behind how we do work in these areas. You know, and this is not just, and we're two Lebanese girls going into this too, you know, Lebanese women. I mean, it's not to say that we're the ones who should, like you said, Elena, we're not the ones who should be spearheading that effort. We're already closer to the context than others, but it's not us, you know, it's not our work to do. It's to grow those spaces, incubate them, maybe we have the privilege, the resources to incubate them, to start, you know, start that comfort, bring people in that wouldn't usually maybe have that avenue. And then it scales up on its own. It scales up because that hasn't been provided yet in a way that's structured or with a vision for the future.
That's feminist and organic also, to see things take the shape they want while we stay there and true to our politics and ethics.
So maybe the next thing we need to do is have this very conversation. I mean, we've been talking about that with a lot of the women.
That's all I asked you.
Anyway, we're 2 minutes over time, so let's not start the feminist revolution right now. Maybe after the webinar. Thanks everybody for joining us. It was such a privilege to be able to share just our thought process, really, as we go through it with you all. And if you liked this and you're interested in kind of more conversations like this with us, but also with others, we do have a webinar series. You can sign up to our newsletter on the Build Up website. That's probably how most of you got here, but just in case. And also we run an annual conference called Build Peace, which is all about the intersection of digital technologies and peace building. This year it's called Computer Says No, because I think we all want to say no after the pandemic. So please join us for that. There's information about the conference also on the website, and the link that Julie just posted also has an opportunity to apply to speak. All of the speakers at Build Peace are curated from a public and open call, so